my first question to you, and we're going to be kind of like sharing this little mic back and forth here. How does urban space figure into your work?
Thank you. My work kind of begins with my movement through the city, and I think Houston's a little bit different than every other city I've lived in. I don't walk as much. I ride my bike less now because of the crazy drivers after the pandemic. But of course, I still drive. I take less public transportation here, but in other cities on the East Coast, these were my movements to the city. They have different speeds. So when you're walking, you notice a lot more than when you're on your bike or when you're driving. So I was born in Alamogordo, New Mexico, which is where the first atomic bomb was detonated. It's a pretty small town. It has an Air Force base that if it ever leaves, the town will probably dry up and blow away. But after that, I lived in Montana, in a town that has 96 people. And so me moving to Chicago and New York later on in my life was something that affected the way I made art and the way I learned and thought. And so it makes sense that it became important to me. My work deals with urban space from that initial movement through the space. A lot of times I make the work in the street, sometimes I leave it in the street and it's displayed there. In DC during the Patriot Act, after 9/11, the city totally changed and there was a lot of new surveillance cameras. So a lot of these pieces in the street were performed, and they were performances in front of these cameras to kind of register in some dark basement of the government somewhere. I would document them with slide film back in the day when slides were still a thing, and that was it. I didn't produce objects, or I produced objects, but a lot of times they were just left in the street and they weren't, brought into the gallery. Houston is entirely different. It's such a bizarre city in terms of coming from the East Coast, which is where I was before I moved here, in DC, of course, and in New York. And so it's been challenging to make work in that same manner. I think actually I've spent some time in Syria, and Damascus was closer to the East Coast cities than Houston. It was easier to make artwork there.
Who are two artists that you are interested
in? I draw a lot from Felix Gonzalez Torres. Right now I've been really into an artist named Cameron Rowland, who he uses pieces that were made by prison labor, and so he goes and he uses the nonprofit status of art spaces to acquire these objects that were made by prison labor. He links it to this long history of slavery, and I think he's really amazing. Felix Gonzalez Torres, I think, was very influential in redefining what the public was, where the object disappears as you consume it. He had such an amazing marriage of politics and aesthetics, and he was really a part of this history of minimalism, and he wasn't just completely divorced from the art world and making these sort of political gestures. Those two.
And how do you choose what materials to work with?
I think it starts on my walks through the city. I see stuff in the street, usually through repetition. I'm walking to my studio. I'm walking to a crappy job, not my new job. But I see stuff through repetition, and it starts to sink in. Sometimes it starts as a joke where I'm kind of laughing at, these ideas, and eventually it becomes material that I use. I think that I try to focus on stuff that we pass by every day, that we ignore visually or psychologically, and use that occasionally to bring into a space like a gallery, which is a space of fetishized walls and lights, you know, a space of enunciation. So they're kind of spotlit in that sense. I have changed over the years, but some of the work remains in the street and it's just reconfigured in a new shape. And then sometimes with the quilt paintings, I'm bringing fabric that I find and wash and cut up and then sew into paintings. But it starts on the walks, for sure.
Have you read any good art books lately?
Arts Properties by David Josselet. Not Forgetting by Rosalind Deutsch is an amazing art history. There's a Houstonian writer, Karen Finlayson, who wrote a book called Perpetual Slavery that is about Cameron Rowland, the artist that I was speaking about, and Ralph Lemon. It's about two artists that are really fantastic. I started work at Glass Tire, and I get emails now asking if I would like a book from like Princeton or UT Texas to review or something. So it's the fulfillment of a lifelong dream to have people sending me free books. And I don't know what our time. How are we doing on time? Okay. Guess we got a little more.
How is the body configured in your work?
That's a I just to speak on it quickly, with the quilts, which are from garments, I think about the bodies that dyed the fabric, that sewed the garments. I think about the people that wore them and lost them on the street. I think about my own body laboring to make them. In the other work, the body is, I've used broken car glass, so I'm thinking about people in danger from car accidents or from break-ins. The body is in all of my work. It is the sort of foundation that it's built on, but it's never shown. It's never configured. There's a space reserved in my work for the body, but I'm not showing or picturing bodies. So I've made bus stop benches in DC from found lumber that was cast off from new construction and gentrifying, and I would sneak those benches into bus stops and just leave them there. So there was a space made for a body to occupy, but I wasn't showing people using them in the documentation or anything. And I think we're out of time. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you.
Any quick questions? Just a request maybe is that, because I'm new to some of your work, if you have something that's in this room that you've made, if you could point it out, that would be really helpful to hold as an image.
Mine's around the corner.
The keys.
And actually, Angela's work is here. You probably can't see it from where you are. It's both in the back room.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Gabriel? All right,
musical chairs.
Okay. Angela Chen is a Taiwanese-American artist, writer, and educator from the ethnoburbs of the San Gabriel Valley, California. Her early work combines autobiographical texts with photographs from personal and family archives to explore the immigrant experience, the process of assimilation, and intergenerational trauma. In the past few years, she has embraced an expanded mixed media practice that calls attention to immigrant materialities and ecological entanglements. Using assemblage as a metaphor for diasporic identity and world building, her most recent work incorporates a range of media: photographic prints and transparencies, photo transfers, textile, plastic, and everyday detritus, foregrounding how the act of photography foregrounding how the act of photographing is embedded in specific political and ecological realities, she weighs her photos down, printing on fabric and encasing photographs in plastic. Angela is a graduate of the Yale School of Art, where she was an Alice Kimball Traveling Fellow and an Art and Social Justice grantee. She previously taught photography at New York University and is currently a photography lecturer at Rice University. Okay. Can you talk about the pieces in the show?
I didn't plan this. But I have 3 pieces in the show, and they're all what I'm calling like excerpts or seats from a larger piece that's at the Moody Center for the Arts. And that piece is a large photo textile. It's 11 feet wide by 28 feet tall. So if you haven't gone to Moody yet, yes, go check it out. But essentially, that piece is called Patchy Anthropocene's Buffalo Bayou, and they're all photographs I took in the fall as I followed Buffalo Bayou from where it begins in the west in Katy all the way to the Houston Ship Channel. So it's photo textile collage on recycled cotton muslin fabric dyed with acorns and sewn together. And so these pieces in the show, this is one of them. This is a photograph of a rattle bush growing out of the Port of Houston concrete area. And then there's 2 other pieces that are what I'm calling excerpts from the larger piece, and those are photographs of plants growing out of the water treatment center that's along Buffalo Bayou.
Will you hold that up?
Yes, yeah.
What do the mirrors in your photo textiles mean to you?
Yeah, so last year I started this series that I was calling Fingering Eyes. And the title of the series was informed by this piece by Eva Hayward, where she's writing about, I think the piece is called Fingering Eyes Impressions of Cup Corals, where she's proposing this multisensory, haptic, optic, observational methodology that is not just seeing, but sensing, and it's a way to think about multi-species encounter that's more embodied. So oftentimes when I think about photography, it is so dematerialized and disembodied, especially today in the digital era. So I really wanted to bring the viewer back into the process of seeing. So when you approach these pieces, when you get close to them, you can see your own eye reflected back out, and then it has these kinds of blanket stitches surrounding them that's holding the mirrors down, and they kind of look like tentacles or arms. So I want to remind viewers that we are in the landscape and entangled within it, so trying to encourage that kind of groundedness.
Excellent. What is your interest in printing on fabric?
Yeah, so I started printing on fabric. I always wanted to print on fabric, but I couldn't technically figure it out for a while. But I have really enjoyed printing on fabric because, well, first of all of these pieces, they're printed on cotton muslin that's dead stock fabric. And I really like working with muslin because it's like a first draft material. So sewers will create a muslin before they make the final garment. So it just suggests to me that something is still in progress and still being worked out. And I'm interested too in using fabric because when I sew it together, I think that it's more, I can more effectively manipulate the surface of the print and kind of call attention to photography's materialities through the use of, this one is flat, so this is not a good example, but I have other pieces that are smocked, so there's this dimensionality, and it's a way to interrupt the grid and to interrupt the kind of 2D way that we encounter photographs.
Will you show the back side of it?
Yes, so some of the pieces are double-sided. This one is not, so not the best, most representative.
But you can see the stitches.
But you can see the stitches, yeah, and you can see where these blanket stitches are kind of surrounding the mirror.
I have a bonus question here.
Yeah.
Did you say dead stock?
Yes.
What does that mean?
So it's fabric that's left over. So
I see.
There are different, well, like on a basic level, I can go to the thrift store and get like a cotton sheet, for example, but there are places where they will source fabric from stores that have closed down. So there was like a quilting store that decided they weren't going to sell fabric anymore, so they had all this leftover material.
I see.
Just-
Yeah. Is there a significance to using natural dye in your work?
Yeah, so for the piece that's up at the Nudie, I dyed the whole piece with acorns because last year, I'm sure you were all familiar with walking around and finding acorns on the ground. So it was a huge mass year, tons of acorns everywhere. And I first thought I could dye with acorns because after it rains, you just see like all the acorn stains everywhere. And it's actually very poetic because as the water is like being absorbed by the acorn, it leaves these trails on the ground. And I think of them as like the acorns making their own marks and making their own work on the pavement. So I thought, okay, like these marks are pretty long lasting. I bet I could use these for a natural dye. And for me, the use of the local material in the fabric itself is a way to embed the photographs in the specific location that I am. Because for me, it's really important to really have a deep sense of place. Like I really relate to what you were saying about walking being a big part of the practice and just the repetition of like what you're seeing outside and how to bring that embodied experience into the piece.
Yeah. It's also interesting that they only stain concrete or human-made elements. You've mentioned that your work is an attempt to think with the ground. Can you elaborate on that? It's kind of
Yes.
a segue.
Yeah, so that using the acorns, that's one thing, but I really relate to what you were saying too about moving to Houston and being such a different city. So I grew up in Los Angeles and then I spent a good number of years on the East Coast and I had never lived in the South and Houston was just a very big culture shock for me. And walking is a very big part of my practice too. So paying attention to the ground is something that just happens when you're walking around, especially when it's really hot and sunny. You like want to look at the floor. And in Houston, the floor is really distinct because it's always cracking and there is mud. So as it dries up and then it swells with water, it just shifts the concrete and breaks it. And then on top of that, there's so much oil and gas activity and groundwater pumping that makes everything sink. So I had never lived in a city where every time I was walking around there's so many tripping hazards and I was like, why is that? And a lot of it is because of, well, first of all, the mud and this and clay and this really young soil and the lack of stability in the ground, but a lot of it is also because of oil and gas. So that was something that I was trying to think through with the Buffalo Bayou piece because, of course, the western portions of Buffalo Bayou, they were left unchannelized, so they're now concretized on the bottom. And that is because of NIMBY organizing, essentially. People were like, don't do this in my backyard. Whereas all of the eastern parts of Buffalo Bayou are the Houston Ship Channel. It's like hundreds of petrochemical industry. Huge refineries, some of the biggest refineries in the US. So I'm really curious about what paying attention to the ground can teach us, but I'm also really interested in the things that we take for granted, things that we think of as the background to human life, and bringing those to the forefront to think about how we can be more mindful and understand that we are part of this greater multi-species entangled life.
Yeah. I mean, we're in it.
Yeah.
I also think Houston is so level, everything stays right there. Okay, before we ask questions, will you repeat the dimensions of the piece at the Moody? Because it's a gigantic piece.
Yes, so it's 11 feet wide and 28 feet tall. And it was not possible for me to look at the whole piece at once because it didn't fit in my house, in my living room. So I was working on it one section at a time. So when we installed it, it was pretty nice to see it all together.
For the first time. Does anyone have questions?
I do, yes. So I wanted to see the wall, And I was wondering, how is it that your students collaborated in it, or will collaborate? Because I didn't get it.
Yes, I know. I should leave a little note on there. So the students are making collaborative works and individual works for the wall, but we haven't put them up yet.
Okay.
So, but they are starting to work. So if you come back in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, there will be something on the wall. So one thing we did in terms of thinking with the ground, we had Anna Mayer, who is a sculptor here in Houston, talk to the students about her practice of gleaning clay. So using clay, that's the byproduct of extraction in her ceramics. And then we went behind the Moody, where the art building is going to have its groundbreaking next week, and just dug some clay out of the ground. And they were like, "Did you put this clay here?" And I was like, "No, it's just right under the grass." So we took it out and we started processing it, and we did some clay painting on a sheet of drywall. So that will probably go on the wall soon. But working with clay, you can put it directly on the wall, of course, but we were trying to learn how to sieve it out, and so that took a few weeks. So come back. I guess stay tuned.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Nobody else has. Which is, do you know how stable the apron is?
I think so. I didn't mordant it or do any kind of pre-treating of the fabric. So it is, if you do mordant it, it will be more stable. But because I didn't, it's somewhat less stable. But acorns, they're very tannic, so they're not going to fade right away, but they will fade eventually.
That's an ephemeral.
Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I thought it sounded good.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So Margot Kramp is an interdisciplinary artist exploring the entanglements between ecology, folklore, and magic. She's currently investigating the phenomena of the unseen, from the microscopic to the mythic worlds that surround us. In her practice, she co-creates along different forms of consciousness, animals, plants, fungi, spirits, stones, light, and subatomic particles. Taking form primarily through sculpture, photography, painting, and ritual, her work traces threads of the mythic, magical, and imaginal across disciplines and histories in search of how they inhabit and trouble the present. So Margot, you've described your work as troubling the delineations between what we might call science and what we might call magic. Could you expand on this for us?
Absolutely. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah? Okay. So I love science and I love what we might call magic, and they don't always like each other. And I think we have a myth in at least in the culture I come from, that magic has died and that science took its rightful place and pushed magic back down, but I don't believe that. I don't think it's a linear process, and I find that they're always touching each other, and sometimes they rub up and it's uncomfortable, but I love the places where they have conversations. So, for instance, in the work over here that I hope you can see at some point, it's a low pedestal with rocks on top, and the rocks are folkloric and magical objects. They're called hagstones, which, if you can't see the artwork, this is a hagstone. It's a naturally holed stone, so a stone that nature put a little window in. And in the culture I come from, there's a folk story that if you look through the hole, you'll see into the other side. You see into the fairy world, if you will. And I became very curious about how we see. And I was reading the history of microscopes, and a person who invented one of the earliest microscopes is the first person who ever saw microbiology, so microorganisms. So in a moment when he looked through a magical glass, he saw into the invisible world. And at the same time, we were still looking into crystal balls to see into the future. And we were also looking through telescopes to see light from the past. And I I just became completely obsessed with this idea of what we look into and the invisible that we see and the things that we're seeing that's beyond our human body perception. And I wanted to create these playful devices that merge those two technologies. So a magical folkloric technology and then microscope lenses and objectives. So they become one tool, one technology together.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your interest in folklore. It's clear you respond to it as a subject matter, but you've also talked about it as a form of technology or even an artistic process. So how does that come to life in your work?
Yeah, so folklore is in everything that I do. And another example, there's a little photo next to the sculpture here on the floor, and that is a solar graph that I made using a pinhole camera, but the pinhole in the camera is actually one of these stones. So what I wanted to see was if you can see through to another world, can I make an image of the other world? What does the other world look like? Could I take a picture of it, and what might we see? And so I'm using the folklore as an actual process. So there's a series of images where what you're looking at is what the stone saw.
There are a lot of ecological themes throughout your practice. How does ecology intertwine with myth and magic for you?
So for me, ecology is all about relationships. It's a web of relationships. And as a practice, magical practice, what we call magic, is at its very most basic sense relational. And those two things talk to each other. My greatest goal is that we could expand ecology to go beyond the natural and to include what we might call the supernatural. So is spirit of place a being in ecology? Is a river a being? Is the air a being? Are the stars alive? Can we pull them into our cosmology and include them and love them?
Could you talk to us about collaborating with your grandfather in this piece right here, Diagrams for Being, and what's the backstory?
Yeah. So my grandfather's dead. I never met him. And I collaborated with him on this artwork because of my mother, who's in the audience. Hi, Mom. My grandfather was a scientist, and as I was told growing up, he was an atheist, at best agnostic. But he made these series of diagrams for my mom on note cards, and these diagrams are very sketchy and kind of haphazard and almost hectic, and they were his vision, his very scientific vision of how the universe worked, how energy moved through the universe, how we touch the divine, and how that all comes together in a system. And so my mom always, who's also an artist, had these diagrams in her studio, so they were always kind of in my periphery growing up. And during the pandemic, I felt so called, it was like a compulsion. I had to make something with these diagrams. When my grandfather was still alive, he told my mother that his dream was to share these diagrams with other people, and he died before he could do that. And so I thought, well, what if I made a print edition of the diagrams? What if I recreated them, honoring the spirit of what he wanted, but making them a bit easier to read, a bit prettier, if you will. So I redesigned them, and I created a series of cyanotypes. And cyanotypes are the first blueprints. So I wanted to honor the idea of the scientific diagram in that way, of an engineering diagram. And yeah, so I think of it as a collaboration beyond the grave, because it felt like he was always over my shoulder, making sure I got it just right. And it also is a collaboration with my mother, because she's the archivist who made sure that these drawings came to me and had a life. And yeah.
And then real quick, do you have a favorite material to work with?
No. No, I don't. I work with so many different materials. They're my collaborators. I think of them as being deeply alive, and they're bossy. I have to listen to them. But right now, I'm working with gouache, which was new. So growing up, my mom painted, and so I refused to paint. I would only do sculpture. And in the last 2 years, I've been making a tarot deck, and I've been using gouache to make miniature paintings to honor the tradition of medieval illuminated manuscript paintings, and I'm just in love with gouache. I wake up every day, and all I want to do is paint with gouache. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions for Marco?
Hi, Mom.
So I think it would really be helpful because everyone has, the word magical and magic has a lot of baggage. Everyone has their own interpretation. And I think it would be helpful if you would explain how you would define your concept of the word magic, because it's a fairly loaded word.
Yeah, it's a word that's really problematic, and lots of scholars argue all the time about what magic is, if it's a useful term. I think ultimately it comes down to that in the English language, we don't have a lot of words to describe what we use that as a blanket term to encompass. And for me, when I talk about magic, and I use that word so that everybody else knows what I'm talking about and I don't sound like I'm throwing a bunch of weird words together, it's a really quick way to get people to feel into what we've created as ultimately as a binary in our culture. So for me, magic is when we dance with the unseen. It's when we're able to affect the world around us, not just with our hands and our rational thinking, but with something else that language just doesn't do service to. And it's like all the things that sparkle out here that you can sense into that. And when you put all those things into a sometimes we do use words with magic, so spells, but it's like a non-verbal way of like touching into the world. It's like if you were a plant, it's when you root in and you do things outside of our normal mode of being, that starts to touch on what I might consider magic. I don't have a good definition for it. I'm always thinking about it. I think it's problematic. Yeah. Thanks, Mom. Hey, Ellen.
It truly is a difficult thing to talk about because, as Shalom pointed out, there is a lot of, it's a loaded word almost. There's a lot of baggage that comes with that word. And I think of it in terms of the mystical, and also mystical comes with loaded, it's a bit loaded as well. But mystical also taps into faith traditions or even folklore, as you mentioned earlier too. But I quite like your definition of magic. I think you're so comfortable with it. This idea of something from without and something from within, interacting in a way that puts something new out in the world.
Yeah.
That's magic. I like your definition.
And
you should stand up.
I think a lot of times people weave religion into magic, and I know atheist witches. Like, you don't have to have a religion to do magic. I think also people will throw around the word energy, and really, what does that mean?
Sure.
What does it mean when we do energy work? What does it mean when we work with energy? I don't know. Everybody, it's different. It's different for everyone, but I think that's what's so beautiful about it.
Yeah, I mean, energy is a scientific term, but it does intersect definitely with the mystical world in interesting ways. So, yeah.
Margaret, I do have one thing to say. Sorry. I also think that magic touches on the unknown, and it's the evocation of the unknown. And I think we're extremely magnetically drawn to the unknown. And sometimes in artwork, an artist is a magician. Because an artist brings together these elements and creates magic. You look at a sculpture, you look at a photo, you watch a video, and suddenly a new world opens up, and if that isn't magical, I don't know what is. Because you're now allowed a portal in which different things come together, and I think that's sublime to me.
is censored, no matter how far you dig deep the atomic level or wormholes or whatever. And so if the sensory is what we can rationalize as real, then the subsensory is the thing that sustains that, of which we cannot by definition understand. We can conjecture. And that's just a human condition if you're lucky.
I'm thinking of how artists on the medium of expressing the relationship between things that we're not able to see and mystical relationships that sometimes it's easy to understand it when we know they are things we cannot see by our eyes, like naked. We can't see it as like we see through telescope. And we can't see things that is, for instance, like Wi-Fi and like things that is electric. We can't really actually present them without a faculty, without a medium. And that happens in art as well, as artists represent those relationships through their work. So it's an invitation for the audience to practice how to see those relationships and being able to see behind or to see on the surface or to make new meanings with combinations. So.
Yeah, that's a beautiful offering. Thank you. I love the idea of medium there, artist as medium, and then psychic medium, and the way we use like artistic mediums. What medium do you work in? And there's some really fun ways those words can talk to each other. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think as artists, we cultivate that sensitivity of feeling it by being artists. But what we need more people to do is also cultivate that.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay, so I have the pleasure of introducing Cindy Travis Clement. Cindy is a Houston-based visual artist who works in sculpture, printmaking, and social sculpture. Her recent work addresses conservation issues, looking specifically at living soil's ability to sequester carbon, soak up rainwater, and support wildlife. Clement incorporates holistic regenerative agricultural principles and systems thinking approaches to create a functional balance between healthy ecosystems, human economics, and societal landscape norms. Current and recent works include Echoes of Existence, a journey through nature's narratives to redefine the Anthropocene, a work in progress she is building with students at Indiana University, Top of Mind, a rooftop installation at the MFAH Glassell School where she teaches eco art, Rumblings, a monumental collection of 50 30-inch by 44-inch watercolor monotypes that draws attention to the unseen 20,000 species of wild bees and other small creatures crucial for a balanced ecosystem, and Symbiosis, a social sculpture and living site-specific installation at the Lawndale Art Center's Sculpture Garden. The anchor to this comprehensive body of work is Endangered Knowledge, the Soul of Humus, which is a bison made from a welded steel armature, a work of regenerative land art covered in topsoil and native grasses. It considers Houston's specific ecological history, living soil's natural history, how they evolved in the Houston coastal prairie, their essential roles within microbial communities and human health, clay's ability to stabilize carbon, supporting the water table that cools the planet, and Houston's economic system. Her works record our natural history to the collective memory so that it will no longer be endangered knowledge. Clement is engaged in an artist in residency at Indiana University Bloomington, fall 2023 and spring-summer 2024. Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner proclaimed August 24th, 2021, Cindy Clement Day for her work to revitalize the community through art and conservation. She was named a finalist for the Art 80 Awards in 2020 and 2021. Clement completed the block program at the Glassell School at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in 2018. So, Cindy, Why do you believe art is vital in solving today's ecological issues?
Well, when I talk to people, people really don't want to talk about the environmental situation because they don't have any hope. And if we don't have hope and we can't picture what hope looks like, we can't have change. So my work is very much focused on the solutions. If you talk to people that are in the soil environmental world, people that were at the Paris climate change meeting where they first saw soil as a solution to climate, they will tell you that we don't have an environmental problem, we have a social problem. People do not see that there is potential for change. So I focus my work on talking about the solutions. And I think that that's really exciting, and it wakes me up every day with a super smile on my face and an eagerness to go at it.
Could you tell us a bit more about what holistic regenerative agriculture is?
So it sounds very rural, and what I think that we need to start seeing is that change in rural America and agriculture is very complicated because it's involved with politics, it's involved with chemical companies, and it's a lot to ask farmers and ranchers who we subsidize them to fail to make a change. So I started looking at, you're an artist, you have to work with materials that you have. I started looking at urban landscapes. And I started seeing, so Houston in particularly is 600 square miles of our inner city. So if we start thinking about applying these principles of regenerative agriculture, which you can see if you watch the Netflix movie, Kiss the Ground, the first scene is at the Lost Plateau in China, where they've used these principles to end desert. It's been documented from when it was just pure sand, going through the 6 principles, which today there's really not the time to talk about the 6 principles, that's for another conversation, but those 6 principles in all of my work I'm looking at and considering.
So I know that you're a research-based artist. What kind of research do you do?
I like to get really into it. I don't want to, I do read lots and lots and lots of books. I read them on auditory books when I'm walking and looking, and sometimes when I'm working. But for the bison, I reached out and I went to a regenerative ranch in Fredericksburg. I've been there every 3 to 6 months for probably the last 5 years. When I first went there, it was completely desertified. It was land that could not be sold. It was sold basically at non-agriculture values. I've helped with bison roundup. I've helped cull a bison. I get in and get dirty. You often look at my hands and they're pretty nasty because I want to see things for myself. I have kind of weird auditory processing issues, so I see things differently than people that don't. So I feel that I will see things other people don't see, so I look really closely and I pay a lot of attention. So hands-on.
Hands-on research.
When I can, yeah.
Okay. So in Run, you have 4 pieces: moving forward, interdependence, baby whisperer, and teamwork. Are there relationships between these pieces?
Yes. So we're a collective, and that's about relationships, right? And this show is about introducing us to this collective and to the Houston art world. So these pieces are the ones sticking up in the back. That's moving forward, and it's about our relationship with urban landscapes. It's made out of found object, concrete, and cast bronze roots that I'm elevating. And the piece has, in my opinion, a lot of movement and life to it, because I think we can reimagine urban landscapes to support. And one of the principles of regenerative agriculture is always keeping a root in the ground. Roots are where we store carbon. Roots are how plants talk to each other, how they absorb chemicals. And we need more roots everywhere. So that's that piece. This piece here is interdependence. This piece is very much about the interconnections of systems thinking. So I'm here looking at urban landscapes. I'm looking at what we do with our dried material after a freeze leaves. I'm looking at the monetary system. I'm looking at butterflies, spiders, basically anything you can find, all these relationships that are interplay in the ecosystems and urban landscapes. In the back piece, Baby Whisperer, that is actually my daughter-in-law, and the baby to come is my granddaughter, and that is with, the picture is with a horse, where the horse is obviously making a connection with that baby. I think we forget to look and see this natural intelligence that wildlife has, and that's just one way we can make that connection. The last piece is a cast bronze by Sindeng. It is right from Rim Ranch, and I made several castings in those. What people don't think about is that's where one of the places that butterflies get minerals. That's where dung beetles start breaking down and decaying. It's that the relationship from our waste with other life is really how life begins. And we have to find ways in urban landscapes to bring back animal impact.
Would you like to expand on interdependence for us?
Oh, well, I kind of did.
Yeah, you did. So we'll go to the last question. Are we okay on time? Okay. So I know how much you are a big proponent of Houston. Why does your work focus on Houston and urban landscapes?
Well, I think, I really just kind of fell into it. I was really just working with what I had, but what I started to see is, so when you read these articles, and I have this radar out, for anything environmental and ecosystem, because I'm obsessive, the cities that have the best chance for saving biodiversity are the tropical cities. So we are not tropical, we are semi-tropical. What people will tell you are the problems with that is most tropical cities are poor. We are not poor. So we have a 12-month growing season. We have one of the most diversity wildlife systems. Out of 800 birds in the US, 600 migrate through here. We have this potential, we have an untapped monetary potential by developing an urban ecosystem. And cities all over the world have urban ecosystems that bring, urban economies that bring them a lot of money. And we also have a great food industry and music industry and art industry and sports industry. So real quickly, that is, at the end, if anyone wants to know more about that work I call Symbiosis Celebration, I happen to have a little flyer on it, and I'm happy to share it.
Thank you, Cindy.
All right.
Any questions for Cindy?
I'm thinking like the word symbiosis, I don't know how much they're aware of Highway's work. And she talks about symbiosis in her book. Can't remember the title, but she had curated a collaboration project which called Crochet Coral Reef, and it's a collaboration. It's a very big collaboration piece with people who do crochet and also the coral reef. And one like relationship that she talks about with the coral reef is that you can't really get really close to them or touching them to be able to collaborate with them. You have to give them space, and you have to, human contact is not something that bring intimacy to them. So she talks about intimacy being something without proximity, and the idea of leaving space for the environment to reach back and to collaborate with you. And then basically they crochet those coral reefs using wasted material, and they put them back into the ocean. And eventually it helps the coral reef to regain their agency to grow too. And I guess my question is how do you see yourself collaborating with, in Houston, species-wise, all the environmental, site-specific-wise, what other collaborations and relationships that you built with the environment? And, yeah.
Well, one of the most exciting things that I've done was not this fall, but the fall before, my symbiosis at Lawndale ended last July. So it was the fall before. And weirdly, there was a plant that I planted along the fence, and the caterpillars that it's a host for were crawling across the concrete and going over the building. And they do what's called J, and that's when they turn into a chrysalis. I counted, and to remember, we're in the museum district. It's sterile. It is 100% sterile. When I took that project over, there wasn't one living organism in a cubic foot of dirt. I counted 200 chrysalis, and then I turned around and I counted as many butterflies as I could see, and I could see 30, and I have 66-year-old very bad eyes. So I try to give it a distance, and I try not to intervene. I don't really ever save anything, but I feel like I feel like by not doing a lot, I did a lot. We really just trusting nature and having it. I believe nature has a natural intelligence with human constructs, and if we let it, we will find that we have a really amazing city and its potential. But we have to let it. We have to let go, get messy. Don't expect things to be sterile and perfect and look perfect all the time. You don't expect yourself or your friends to look perfect all the time. Why would you expect your landscapes to be sterile and immaculate all the time? Getting brown and old is beautiful, guys. I have a lot of kind of weird humor. J.R. is a conceptual and research-based artist who broadly investigates the spaces created by the intersections of mystery, queerness, and the sublime. Utilizing a multiple disciplinary, these inquiries often stem from geological sites as an impetus to document the psychic history residing there can affect our contemporary experience. These explorations result in environmental recollection, whereby to create immersive installations and mappings containing arrangements of found and made objects. Drawings and lens-based works based off that data. J.R.'s work serves as a nerve center to intuit and spatial exchanges happening at these locations, documenting the geospectral networks embedded within while creating new phenomenological and mythologies. J.R. holds an MFA at the Visual Arts of Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University and a BFA in Art and Visual Technology from George Mason University, Fairfax, Virginia. J.R. has shown across the United States internationally and has further been an artist in residence at the Galveston Artist Residency, the Solar Studios at Rice University, the Woodstock Burgcliff Guild, the Chattanooga Institution, Alexander, Virginia's Torpedo Factory Art Center, among others, along with upcoming residency at Lighthouse Works in Fishers Island, New York. J.R. has worked in various public and private collections and has worked in between New York, Washington, D.C., Minneapolis, and now Houston. All right, tell us about, so J.R.'s piece is the big piece in the little back room. It's been evolving, this whole exhibition. If you haven't seen it lately, make sure you check it out. So tell us about that piece.
Yes, so the title of that piece is Entanglement Study Number 1, and the byline is in Precision in Cosmic Bodies, Primitive Notions, and a Search Among Anticipated Moments. And so that piece came about, just a little bit of through line history, I guess, is that there were half of us, most of us in the show came on into Throughline, I think in November it was. And so when we were starting to plan for Run, you know, a lot of us had to figure out what we were going to show, basically. And so I primarily work in installation, and so I knew that I wanted to try to do one, although I wasn't entirely sure how to do that in like the time span that we had. So every year, me and my two dogs, we do a road trip to the east coast, because that's where most of my family is, and I go to the Washington D.C. area because that's where my partner currently is. And I lived there for about 10 years, and I worked in the bar industry there in queer spaces. And so I'm sure anybody who does road trips knows that it's like kind of like really meditative and introspective process. And so I was driving back and I was thinking about like my life and my history and all of that kind of stuff. And so I realized that I kind of really missed being in queer spaces. You know, the older I've gotten, the less opportunity, just from, I feel like being old to a certain extent, the less opportunity I've made for myself in order to go to these spaces. And so I had been working with, if you go back there, you'll see there's these black squares. And so I've been working with them a little bit before, and for me, they're kind of like windows into this alternate dimension. This is a kind of tangent, but I'm really into like the current UAP mythology building, and a lot of people who study that reference UFOs as windows into something else. And so I was thinking about that and thinking about, you know, this idea of building identity within queer spaces, within safe spaces. And so I started to kind of collect all of these moments that I had in my memory, and so that's where I started to kind of like pinpoint, literally tying all these kind of things together. So the piece ultimately for me becomes this idea of like a dance or a kind of, what's the right word? A meshing or an immersion into these spaces that queerness can create. So that's where that piece, the impetus for that piece came from.
Car trips are amazing for the time to think that it gives you. So what's the biggest influence for your body of work?
The biggest influence for me artistically in general, and this is going to be a bit of a wild ride, so bear with me, is the fact that I grew up in a haunted house. And so from a very young age, I had an inclination that there was something happening behind the fabric of reality that we couldn't really explain, or that we tried to explain, but maybe in ways that weren't really satisfying. And so I lived in that environment of constantly questioning what I saw around me, what is real, what is imaginary, what is happening because of stimuli that's encouraging me to think certain things. When I did my grad work at Rutgers, I grew up in northern Jersey, and so I invited a paranormal team to go to my childhood house and do an investigation. And that was part of my thesis work. And what they found is that throughout the house, there's really strong electrical currents. And so, you know, how much of what my family was experiencing as a physiological reaction versus how much of it was a supernatural reaction, we don't really know, but it's that kind of like overlapping that I'm really interested in figuring out. Kind of what like Margot was saying of what's real, quote unquote, what is real but unseen, and how those two come together to kind of create our perceptions.
So why art? Why is art important to you? How did that play in?
I've been thinking a lot about this question, wondering how I was going to answer it. And I think, obviously, we all think art is important. I don't think we would be here if we didn't. Being an educator, I often get students coming into my classes who are kind of like forced to be there. It's like a fulfillment, and they're like, "Why does this matter?" And there's this really great book that I love that kind of boils down notions into really succinct kind of tidbits. But one of them is that art is the way a culture describes itself to itself. And I just really I really love that, and I think that students really get that, and they get it really easily. And I also think art is what remains when all of us are gone. From even from like Paleolithic times, we don't have a lot of what was there except the art that is left. I always think of Werner Herzog's Cave of Forgotten Dreams, where he goes in and he talks about how the cave paintings are meant to be viewed by torch. And so you go in and they kind of move and shift and they undulate in this space. And humans were thinking about this 30,000 years ago, and so that's always really amazing to me, and that's what I hold on to when I get cynical about certain things.
That is fascinating. So, do you have heroes in the art world or the paranormal world?
Yeah. Yes. My heroes in the art world, going back again to what Gabriel was saying, Felix Gonzalez Torres has been a huge inspiration to me, along with Ankawara, for all the reasons that Gabriel said, but also because, if you notice, it's often hard for me to speak, and their work, I think, talks about quietness in a way that's still very, very powerful, and so. Going back to why art is important, I found those two artists in particular who were able to sculpt a visual language in a way that was really moving, but with saying as little as possible, in a way that minimalism never really worked for me, and still able to move somebody. Move a viewer by saying the least amount possible. So those are two of them.
So what's your next project?
Well, Cindy, funny you should mention that. So Cindy and we have Throughline has a Photo Fest show that's coming up March 8th, I think it opens.
Yes.
And so that will be up through the end of March, and then Cindy and I are the first two-person show to happen in the space. So that's going to be our next project.
Yeah, a collaboration.
Yeah.
So just imagine an exhibition of his work and my work. I struggle hearing right, he struggles speaking right. It's going to be really interesting to watch. And we don't yet know what it is, but I'm really excited to work with him because I see that he's a keen observer also, and that he thinks conceptually, and for me, it's going to be really fascinating to see how his working and thinking and process influences my work, especially since visually our languages are so different, but at the heart, I think we're really very similar. So I hope you'll be interested. I do want to say one thing that I wish I had said at the beginning. Oh wait, anybody have any questions for JR before I get into that?
Yes, Mom.
I have one, yes. Okay, have you worked over time in the past when you have worked on this piece? And if so, what new doors has it opened for your practice and way of thinking and processing?
I do often work overtime. I have a fairly robust photography practice also, and that's part of the reason why I love photo is Hiroshi Sugimoto calls it the fossilization of time. And so I really like that idea of folding down durations into moments. That being said, I often work in durations mostly because I always envision this grand thing that can't really happen in time space that's supposed to happen in. And so I got really anxious, or used to get really anxious about that, and then I was just like, screw it, I'm going to do what I want to do. And so the other aspect of this is that I don't currently have a studio, and I actually very, very rarely have a studio. So it was a chance for me to work in a space that I wouldn't have been able to work in, otherwise. And so that's why I call it a study, because it's really me exploring things that I've had in the back of my mind for a while, but I hadn't had the physical space in order for me to actually do. But being in installation based, time is a huge factor in that. I always read that Sarah Z gets like 2 months to install all of her work with her assistants and whatever else. And I think that I can do that with my lonesome, and so that's part of how that durational aspect comes into play.
There seemed to be an aspect of this piece as I watched it over time that you acted and reacted to your own actions. Is that typical in your work as well?
Yes, partially because I don't really like to plan. I'm a very and this is just general, especially when I work with sites, I'm a very intuitive kind of responder. And that I think also comes from growing up in a haunted house. I think intuition is really key with that, but also as an artist. And I often say this to people, but installation art gets kind of poo-pooed a lot in the art world, and it's not on the level as like painting and whatever else. But I really find that doing installation is really this, whether you're working in a 3D, 4D space, or whether you're working on a flat surface, you're still thinking about the decisions that you're making with the piece and then reacting to them in a very similar way. And so, I had a rough idea of what I wanted with that, but it was very much dictated by the material and by how it was all laying out. You can try to plan, and this is what I've learned doing the kind of work that I do, is that you can try to plan as much as possible, but something's always going to throw you for something, and you just have to kind of roll with it and then allow yourself to react to those happenings.
The same with nature. I'm just saying. Anybody else?
I have a question. Actually, it's not a question. How would I put it? I don't know. Yes, a comment that might end up as a question. So, you mentioned that you two were going to be the two first artists showing in the space. And for the people here that are not designers, would you explain a little bit about that happening and that as a system for us here? Did I make myself clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's 20 of us within the collective. If each of us had a solo show, it would take 4 years, for all of us to get through the roster. And so the way that it was decided is that we're going to pair up. And so 2 artists within the collective will show, I think, for about a month at a time. And then we go through the roster, and then it all happens all over again the next kind of year and a half. So that's the structure of it for everybody. Barring any other shows, like PhotoFest or anything else that comes up that we throw in the schedule. Anything? Did I miss anything, Sylvia?
No, I think that covers it. Any other questions? Got it.
Well, as an enthusiast of designer, I would say that I think it's fascinating what's happening. I think it's fascinating the potential that is, among each other and the bodies of work we're all developing. I think it's a great happening, you know, in the city. I think I'm so happy and proud of us and to be here, and even this talk of today, because we really didn't know a lot about each other's work, and this is a constant discovery, and I celebrate. Thank you for today, it was wonderful.
So on that note, I'll end with, I just want to say that I think this artist community, this city, to be here now with the people that move in, the diversity that we have, that this is an amazing art community. I feel so fortunate to be here, and for us to be recording these talks and seeing what's happening, I feel like we are the future of art in the United States, and we need all to recognize that and uplift it and talk about it more, and support each other's groups as much as we can, and invite communities that aren't aware of this richness that we have, this culture here in Houston, and uplift it whenever we can. So that's the little rah-rah cheerleader in me that I can't ever. So thank you.